There we go. Thank you for coming out on this cold and miserable day. We are very lucky to have Reverend Dr. Emma Percy here today. Most of you will know who Emma is, but just in case you don't, she is both the Trinity College chaplain, welfare dean, and also pertinently to this talk, she's also the chair of Women and the Church, which is an organisation, I think primarily within the Church of England, campaigning for kind of greater women's equality and women's representation. So I won't say any more. I'll let Emma introduce herself.
Have I got this? Can you just show me? Is this on? Okay. Good, lovely to see you. I'm going to talk for a bit, and then we'll maybe pray for a bit, and then we'll talk for a bit. Does that make sense? So, a number of years ago, I found myself splashed across national newspapers, various radio shows, even the great excitement for me of being able to be on the PM programme on Radio 4, because I was talking about the language that we might use in our prayers in addressing God. And that's a little bit what I want us to reflect on today as we think about what prayer might mean within a culture where we are doing our best to look towards equality between the genders and actually understanding that in a different way. The German playwright Frank Wedekind wrote, "God made man in his own image and man returned the favour." I doubt if Frank was playing with ideas of gender in this quote. I think he was much more likely making a statement about how the concept of God has been used and abused to serve certain ideas about human beings. But I think it's a very apt quote for what I wanted to say to you today. For I think it's fair to say that man, as in the male idea of humanity, has historically tended to perpetuate the idea of God as being male, and that has played into all sorts of our thinking about how we view the different genders. Some of this is, of course, simply the way language has historically worked. He has been the default pronoun used for much of history, both for humans collectively and for male humans specifically. Man, as we know, has been a collective term both for humans and the term for a male human. And those things for most of our lives have been used rather interchangeably. I was fascinated, I don't know if we've got any French scholars here, I was fascinated to find that in the French language, as soon as a crowd has one man in it, it takes on a male gender. It only takes one man to make everything male. We tend to see, and we have historically seen, things of status, things that are rational and ordered as being male, and what is not male as being somehow other, and women are other to men. If we go back to the Bible, we find that in Genesis chapter 1, 26 to 27, we're told that God said, "Let us make man," as in the generic term for humanity, "in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. So there's something in that earliest understanding of what it means to be human that says that both male and female are made in the image of God. Not that actually there is humanity made in the image of God that's male, and then there's another human being that is female, that is somehow less human, and therefore less like God. Traditionally, little attention has been paid to what that inclusion of the female might mean for our understanding of God. It's generally assumed that women are made in the image of God insofar as they share a common humanity with men, whereas traditionally male humanity has been seen as the normal state of being human. If we define a human, it's a man, with women as some kind of derived state, a different kind of human being. And this has meant that womanliness, femininity, whatever it is that makes people women, has not been associated with the image of God in the way that masculinity has. In fact, tradition has tended to see womanliness as part of the more animal nature of humanity, about the baser things, less about the mind and the soul, more about the body and the emotions. At times in the church's history, it was thought perhaps that holy women would in fact become men when they got to heaven, laying aside their female bodies to reveal grown-up masculine souls. In today's world, we're much more conscious of how we use gendered pronouns. And working in a university, I'm particularly conscious that even the kind of consciousness raising I had in my growing up around how we used terms about male and female is being challenged anew in trying to actually understand how we include people who don't fit neatly into the binary definitions that we're used to using. We try far more, some of us get fed up with it, but we do try and work out how we can use men to mean men and not to mean men and women. How do we find other kinds of collective terminology so that actually when we're talking about a group of people, we're not actually always gendering it in a masculine way. We try not to assume that there is a normative kind of human being and that everything else is different. But in doing that, we're seeking to change centuries of assumptions. It's really interesting that I've been talking to a number of people recently about healthcare and things like this, and one of the interesting things around healthcare is that so much has been predicted on the notion that there is a normal human body, and that's a white man. And that has really interesting implications because a lot of the ways that we've developed things around how we treat people doesn't take into account the fact that actually there isn't one normative kind of human being, and there are different ways of how we live and work. So this notion of trying not to use man to collectively mean men and women has actually had an impact on how we think about prayer when we think about prayer collectively as a church. It was a hot topic when I was at theological college at the end of the 80s. There was a little booklet published called Making Women Visible, which was trying to look at how did we actually change our language to make it more inclusive. And much of the modern liturgy of the church has moved on in some ways to try and have a more inclusive way of talking about each other when we gather to worship. But it's amazing how much of the old stuff continues to creep in. Some of that, as we know, is difficult because our faith and our prayer life and our worship is shaped by things that have tradition and resonance and beauty and poetry that has been handed down the years. And for all my feminism, I can get very fed up when I find that a particular loved hymn has been tweaked around with, and I have to have a little conversation in my own head as to where I feel about it. Some things we don't want to change. But if we don't want to change them, if, like me, the standard services I use in the college chapel or the Book of Common Prayer, which clearly uses quite gendered language about how we talk about people, then I think we need to explain it and acknowledge the clunkiness of such outdated ways of rendering women invisible. It's perfectly possible to say, this is a traditional text. It doesn't actually represent the fact that we actually think that the only way to talk about humanity is using male terminology. Do we put notices in our orders of service if we use traditional things, telling people that? Do we actually think about mixing things up? Is this a conversation that you have as a church? Do people feel comfortable with that? It's a question that we can come back to, but it's one I think if we're thinking about prayer in this situation that actually ought to be on the agenda of your church. Being inclusive in terms of how we speak about each other, how we talk about ourselves, the congregation, wherever we're praying, is one thing. It all gets much more complicated when we start trying to talk about God, when we start trying to address God. This God in whose image both men and women are in some way made. How do we talk about this God that reflects that? Why do we only speak about God in male imagery and with male pronouns? If women also reflect the divine nature, ought there be something that we do that actually reflects that? The Old Testament was very clear that speaking about God is always a process of metaphors and images. Pile on pile of interesting metaphors and images we find in the Old Testament. One of the key things that they were trying to convey in the different writings that we have is that God was and is beyond full human comprehension. And it is this, to some extent, that defines God. So in the Old Testament we find that God is encountered as something like fire, cloud, glory, a still voice after the violence of a storm. There's lots of kind of tentative, kind of reaching out to say God is really hard to talk about, but these images can convey something of what we want to say. God is uncontainable and unfathomable. And there's something very important in the Old Testament about wanting to say that, because they were living in a culture where gods around them could be quite neatly defined, could be quite neatly explained. But the problem is this uncontainable, unfathomable God that they worshipped and that we worship seeks to know people and to relate to people. And therefore, if we're going to talk about relationships that are interpersonal at some level, then we actually have to start using much more human metaphors, and we end up having to use pronouns. The human metaphors that the Old Testament uses are perhaps a little more mixed than we often think. God definitely is like a mighty king, a warrior strong to save, but God is also depicted as a mother feeding her child, holding the weaned child against her breast for comfort. God, we're told, has a strong arm, a compassionate heart, a fierce anger, and a sense of justice, a merciful and forgiving nature. God has arms to fight with and to hold, and breasts to feed and to comfort. And all of those are images that we find in our Bible. The images are multiple. And the people of Israel were at pains to differentiate their understanding of God from the local gods. The God of Israel was not neatly containable, neatly defined. And one of the things they wanted to distance God from was the local female fertility goddesses. So care needed to be taken in ensuring that God was not like them. So often the feminine nature of God is discussed in terms of wisdom, and that kind of sense of wisdom being this female personification, very different from the fertility goddesses. Of course, there's one point where God defines God's own self, naming as I am who I am, the one who is. This is, of course, a gloriously gender-neutral statement. But in writing and speaking and teaching about God and praying to God, a God who's personal and interested in people, pronouns are and were necessary. It's not at all surprising that the default male pronoun has been routinely used for God. And it's not surprising that those in power over the generations who have shaped the church have stressed particularly the attributes and images of God most associated with their own values, affirming how God mirrored their own desired images. So God is more often addressed as King, Lord, and Father, because those are images that make sense to people. And as he is so addressed, the idea can quite quickly come that these metaphors start to be lost, and God is not simply like a male king, but God is at some level a male king, and that God is male. Of course, one of the issues we have in our language about prayer and praying to God is the New Testament and the fact that Jesus, as a Jewish man, uses Father as his term for speaking about God. And Paul talks about God in relation to Jesus, using Father, Son imagery. I think it's really important for us to remember that the significance about this Father-Son imagery in the New Testament, and especially in both Jesus' own use and Paul's use, is that it's about inheritance. It's about heirs. It's about that sense that the Father is the one who is enabled to, the Son inherits from the Father. And this is the key thing that Jesus is wanting to get across and that Paul continually gets across. Now we live in a world with very different views on inheritance, on gender roles and family identities. So we need to be careful that we do not simply translate our modern understandings of Father onto the New Testament language and assume that the key aspect about that role is its maleness, rather than looking at what it signified in its context. Jesus also told us some interesting parables, and it's funny how we interpret them. I was to talk the other day, and as somebody said, we have three very famous ones in Luke: the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son. And the speaker was saying, isn't it interesting that we're very clear that we think that the shepherd is God, the father in the prodigal son is God, but the housewife, she's just a woman. We don't actually see that parallel. We don't actually pick up that Jesus was using feminine imagery to help us to think about God, because it's not in our psyche. We ignore those aspects of our tradition. So how can we pick up the imagery that is less bound up with gender roles and begin to mix up our God language? And is that something we should be doing? In all of our regular language for God, there seems little room for the idea that women too reflect the image of God. And that, I think, is problematic for all of us, not just for women. Most of us have been brought up with an unrelating sense of the maleness of God. We may know intellectually that God is beyond gender, that the sexual differences that take on such importance in human interactions are, of course, meaningless for a God who has no need to reproduce. And yet we find, and even somebody like me finds, that when we start to talk about God as she, to draw on specifically female experiences of life to imagine the divine, we can find ourselves feeling that we're behaving inappropriately, that we're almost being transgressive. Somehow it feels like we're importing sexuality into God. It's an interesting question about why do we feel that? Why, if we use a feminine word for God, do we feel that we're doing something that isn't quite right? And what does that say about how we think about God? And what does it say about how we think about women? There are some interesting examples from the past. People did play with these ideas. Famously, the ones that came to mind when I was writing this is Anselm, who would quite often pray to Jesus the Mother, Bernard of Clairvaux, who was particularly interested in meditating on the imagery around breastfeeding in the Bible, both in Paul's use of it, particularly Paul, because Paul talks about himself being like a breastfeeding mother and how he cares for the church. Drew on that. And Julian of Norwich, that amazing 14th century spiritual woman writer, who consistently referred to Jesus as mother and plays with that as a very strong image in her understanding of the Trinity and her understanding of our salvation. It mattered to those people. They were clearly trying to find something in their spirituality and their prayer. And I think it matters now for men as well as women. How do we better understand God and humanity if we don't explore the aspects of God that are reflected in women's lives? So my suggestion is that women need this because they need to play with language that celebrates the divine image in their experience of being human. Women need to think about what their life experience is, bodily, socially, however it's come together, and think about where that can be found in our understanding of God. What does it mean to have been a woman who breastfed my 2 sons, to meditate on Psalm 131, that glorious psalm where we're told that we are to be like the weaned child that comes to its mother's breast. The image of God is that. That lovely thing I remember when my kids were old enough to wander off and no longer dependent on me, but yet they would come and climb back onto my lap. What does that do to my prayer life if I think about actually God having that kind of sense of relationship to me? What if I put myself in that place? How does that feel? Women need to have some kind of affirmation in knowing that being a woman is good enough for God. There is still so much that makes women feel that they are inferior, that their experience is lesser, that they are at some level sort of the add-on to life. What does it mean for women to know that feminine language is good enough to talk about God as it is for them? What does it do for our self-esteem, our sense of self-worth? And women need to know that at some level, God recognises them and rejoices in the wonder of the creation that is woman. It's part of God's glory, and God's self-expression is found in who we are. And we need to find ways to celebrate that in our prayer and in our worship. And men need this too, because men need to be unsettled and understand that God is not simply an amplified male. Because that's quite important for men to actually have a proper perspective of who they are and where they are in the world. They need to recognise the incompleteness of their understanding of the divine. That yes, God is both like them, but also unlike them. And that there are things about who God is and how God is that they might need to learn from looking and listening to women. And they might then find that it's important to look and listen to women. And they might come to really understand and believe that women are good enough for God. And that might begin to change how women are treated in the world. We live in a world where we continue to deal with violence towards women at great extremes, where oppression of women, the denial of education and justified discrimination on both religious or ideological grounds is a reality across our world. We live in a world where gender justice, empowering women, giving women a right to be heard, to speak, to make decisions about their own lives, is one of the millennial goals. Because we know that where we can change women's lives, we actually start to act on changing issues around poverty and the lives of the people at the bottom of the pile. thinking about how we as a church and we as individuals view and respect and honour women is something that is fundamentally important and missional. We need to do it as a church because the church is losing young women far quicker than it's losing young men. The statistics are quite shocking. So in the figures, better figures from the States than here, of those who don't attend church, it's going up for all young people, but it's gone up about 80% for young men over the last sort of 25 years and 125% for young women. As we change the way women are treated in our society, the way the church doesn't understand and respect women becomes more and more of a turn-off. And there are missional issues. Not least because many churches have been kept going by the hard work of a lot of lay women. And if we don't get the next generations in, it's going to start to seem to be an issue. So these things matter. They matter for how we pray publicly, and we need to think about that. And they matter for how we pray privately. So if you are someone who prays, whether you are male or female, I encourage you to play with your God language, to try out some different things, to see what it feels like if you pray to God as mother, if you mix the pronouns and address God as she. I am not arguing, I promise you, for any kind of wholesale change. I want mix, I want variety. But I am suggesting that we should have some unsettling of the dominant picture, a way of reconnecting more fully to the idea that the female and male are made in the image of God. I think that this will strengthen our witness to the world. I think it will encourage us in our challenging the justice issues that we need to think about in terms of how women are treated across the world. I think it'll be good for encouraging our mission, and I think it will help to challenge and refresh some of the ways we think and pray as we recognise more of the breadth and the richness of God. So I'm going to end with prayer, and then we'll have some questions, and then we may have a few more prayers. Is that okay? So let us pray. God, our Mother, creator of all that is, whose compassion is boundless and whose judgment is shaped by mercy, look kindly on us, your children, and teach us to value all of humanity, that we may learn to see the divine spark in those who are like us and those who are different, that we who are made women and men in your image may work together to build up the common good and establish heaven's values here on earth. Amen.